very important for developments at the time was the movable type printing press, specifically that developed by Johannes Gutenberg. Early years of it did not make much of an impact, because once the press was used in ways that didn't make the type difficult to read. So in the early years it was very difficult to read, but eventually it becomes very important as people could more clearly read what was printed. Gutenberg developed the press in 1439 and printed the first dated book in 1457, a book that actually has a date printed in it. It was a copy of the Psalms. The press would become useful for disseminating scholarly work as the Renaissance developed. And there were, at the time, scholars who began wandering from city to city looking for and spreading ideas. The press was used for copying classical literature and other works, but it really wasn't until the Reformation when it was turned to informing the masses. And so by this time, the Reformation period, the 1500s or so, it's now producing works for a mass audience instead of an elite or intellectual audience. It does make textual criticism easier to read, especially for biblical studies. And of course, as paper making develops, that becomes important as well. Paper making had been gained by way of the Muslims who had gotten it from China. So it's kind of eventually making its way to Europe. So the Renaissance is very much a Christian event, even though it sets the stage for people to challenge Catholicism and Christianity in general. The main individuals still considered themselves Christians. They still thought God was behind nature, even if they started to question traditional views about this. But there was a critical approach to worldview Christianity that was on a greater scale than before. Furthermore, you had some people like Dante who interwove Christian literature with classical literature, mythology. Others would question the uniqueness of Christianity, believing they could find Christian truths in other religions. Other aspects of the Renaissance also endeavored or also fostered patriotism in these new nations. It also led to changes for noble women who now had greater access to texts, had access to liberal arts education, and some of these women, humanists interested in the process of poetry and literature and art, become scholars in their own right, inspiring other women through writing and poetry, art. And of course, they too faced criticism because of this, some from men and some from women as well, who did not think that was a woman's role to do that. Well, they've mentioned lastly the work of Niccolo Machiavelli because of its development of a political theory that will become important later as well. Machiavelli had risen to power in Florence, but ended up being banished from there. His most famous work is known as The Prince. Often it's been considered a purely secular study of political theory. Inspired by the Roman Republic, Machiavelli believed that the church's role in the state destroyed the state's power to govern, so that the state must restrict the power of the church. The church should only govern in the spiritual realm. It should not have influence in the secular realm. In turn, the prince, the ruler, should be focused on power and not morality. That wasn't to be a concern. And in all of this, cruelty was acceptable if it consolidated power and discouraged revolution. As you might expect, because of some of the ideas, the print ended up on the list of banned books that was beginning to be developed as well. What questions do you have about the Renaissance? Anything? I mean, obviously, a lot more could be said about the Renaissance, but anything that we've talked about here?
Was around now the time when a lot of effort was being put into making cathedrals larger, much grander church buildings?
Yeah, you're starting to see that at the end of the 1100s, 1200s, and then now in this period as well, because of some of the developments and what people are able to do architecturally that they hadn't been able to do in previous centuries. Other questions? Let's then turn to talking about the Inquisition and some things related to the Inquisition. We introduced the Inquisition in the last section, later Middle Ages. And we mentioned how the Inquisition was particularly active in France throughout the later Middle Ages. We'll talk more about this in a little bit. Toward the end of the 15th century, it became very active in Spain as well. And although remembered for supporting Columbus's voyage, Ferdinand and Isabella were also responsible for the development of the Spanish Inquisition. At one point, led by Thomas Torquemada, the Grand Inquisitor, not only was there a concern about heresy, there were concerns about converts from Judaism and Islam, and perhaps more than others, there were quite a bit of abuses in the Spanish form of the Inquisition. The use of torture was much more common in Spain than previously, and by the 1530s there were 19 Inquisition courts in Spain. Once Protestantism developed, it too would come under one of the oversight of the Inquisition in trying to stop Protestantism. As an example of the efforts of the Inquisition and life in the later Middle Ages, I want to take a look at the city of Montaigu in France. The reason this city is one to look at is because of the amount of records we have on city life due to the activity of the Inquisition then. And a lot of records were held, or kept and preserved. In the 1300s, though, it was a town filled with heretics. Supposedly, it was the last town that supported the Cathar, or Albigensian heresy. Ferguson talks a little bit about this. Often the Cathars considered themselves as Christians in opposition to the Catholics, who were not considered to be faithfully following Christianity. And they had a very Manichaean type of theology where there were two opposite deities, or two opposite principles, light and dark, spiritual, physical. And there's a lot of ways in which Albigensianism seems like Gnosticism. There's some parallels there. Individuals were inducted through baptism by the book and by words instead of baptism by water. And after baptism became parfaits, not that kind of parfait. The Latin word would be perfecti. And so they became perfect through this baptism of the Word. The person that thus became the parfait had to remain pure. They were not to eat meat. Now, meat here predominantly meant like beef, lamb, etc., not necessarily fish. They also had to stay pure from women as well. Most of the people, however, were just ordinary believers. They led a very common life until they were close to death, when they would finally be baptized. And once they were baptized, they had to embark on total suicidal fasting. And so eventually you're kind of fasting yourself to death. The head of the Inquisition at the time was a man named Jacques Fournier, who would later become Pope Benedict XII, during the Avignon papacy. He supervised the Inquisition in the 1300s and recorded the depositions of those that were investigated in this heresy. As Pope, he tended to be a reformer, was not particularly interested, though, in becoming Pope, and is rumored to have said to have elected an ass when he had been selected to be Pope. Evidently, he was present for most of the ecclesiastical trials that these individuals from Montague underwent, but rarely resorted to torture. As I mentioned, we know about life in this town because of the records of the Inquisition. The court was in session 370 days between the years 1318 and 1325. There were 578 interrogations that were done. 418 of those were of people accused of heresy, and 160 of those were from witnesses. Essentially, there were 98 cases involving 114 people, most of whom were heretics of the Albigensian kind. Predominantly, peasants, artisans, shopkeepers. 48 of the 98 were women. Now, this is rather significant, not because of the numbers themselves, it doesn't sound like it's that large, but Montague at the time probably only had about 200 to 250 residents, so half of those are implicated in some sort of heresy. They were grouped in basically 40 households. The focus of the city was around cereal production. Oat and wheat were some of the main crops. Turnips were also prominent as well. Labor was divided by sex. The men plowed and harvested. They hunted and fished. The women were in charge of the home. They were in charge of keeping vegetables, cutting the cabbages, tying sheaves, winnowing weeds. Animals would be penned in close quarters with the families, not separated into other buildings, unless you were wealthy. The city, however, tended to suffer from chronic poverty. There weren't a lot of crafts done by people. Any tailoring that was done by traveling parfecti. They ate fish, but not bacon or butcher's meat, due to the Cathar teachings. And often, of course, the careless word could end you up before the court. It was a world of intrigue and spies and betrayal, where people would accuse each other of heresy. If convicted of heresy, you would end up in prison, or you might be, depending on if you recanted or not, you might end up wearing a yellow cross on your clothes to identify it. There doesn't appear to have been strong tensions between nobles and non-nobles in Montague. Instead, the tensions were between church and citizen because of the views of the Cathars. It was a city not only of heresy, but a variety of immorality. The transcripts tell the tales of temporary unions, and people where they would technically get married for a short time just to have sex, and then would have that annulled. People had multiple mistresses. There were illegitimate children. There was rape that occurred. Priests would seduce people. Homosexuality was common. And so it's a heretical town. It's an immoral town. And it's also a town that's kind of syncretistic when it comes to religion. Despite the presence of Catharism, people still held on to some Catholic beliefs. Particularly, they believed, right before death, unless they were very, very strict Cathars, that they wanted to confess to Catholic priests. And so even though they had some Cathar views, a lot of them wanted to confess before death. And even First Communion and marriage were still done under the auspices of the Catholic Church and not necessarily under Cathar, the perfected. So we have here the later Middle Ages, the end of the Middle Ages, this complex interweaving of personal experience and Christianity. Right? It's not, we can't say it's really wholesale one or the other. It's kind of mixing it together. And people would often connect Christianity with other belief systems. Now, Montague is probably an extreme, right? This isn't a common town in France, let alone a common town in Europe. But it might represent to us how people on the ground are combining a variety of thoughts and practices into their lives as Christians. They're interweaving these things together and not beholden to strict observances of one or the other. Questions or comments about Montague or the Inquisition? We'll go ahead and end there for today. Don't forget the assignments coming up. On Tuesday, we'll pick up with a variety of doctrines developing during this time period, which will become important for setting the stage for the Reformation. So we'll end